Just before we get started with this video, I do want to say that it's brought to you by me, or rather by another channel that I do called Business Plays. More on that in a bit. On July 1st, 1946, 22,000 people gathered at the remote Bikini Atoll to witness history. In the heart of the lagoon, some 90 leftover vessels from World War II had been gathered, their metal corridors now home to only a dozen pigs, goats, and rats. As military personnel, scientists, and journalists looked on, a plane dropped a single bomb above the lagoon. There was a flash of light, and intense warm winds that whipped across the audience's faces, and a minute later, a deafening blast. The explosion marked the first detonation of a nuclear bomb since World War II, the first detonation to take place at Bikini Atoll, and it certainly wasn't going to be the last. Over the next 16 years, the United States would detonate 23 atomic devices over Bikini, transforming the landscape. In the course of the tests, 3 whole islands would be vaporized, dozens of ships sank, and radiation blanketed over the entire island chain. Yet Bikini Atoll wasn't some random, uninhabited place. For centuries, it had been home to a people now turned into the world's first atomic refugees. In the video today, we're diving into the story of both those refugees and the nuclear tests that shaped the modern world. Way out in the empty wastes of the Pacific lies a series of 29 atolls and 5 islands scattered across almost 1 million square kilometers. Known as the Marshall Islands, these little specks of land are all but invisible on a map, with the biggest atoll covering a mere 16 square kilometers. But if you were to zoom in on the far northwest of those islands, you might eventually come across a crude white circle of sand, looking sort of like a necklace carefully discarded by some giant. The name of that tiny sliver of life? Well, that's Bikini Atoll. Comprising 23 islands surrounding a 600 square kilometer lagoon, Bikini Atoll is a place of pristine beaches and swaying palm trees. But don't let its idyllic appearance deceive you. It's also a place that has been battered by the storms of history. Although at least one scientific journal has claimed Bikini Atoll was settled in prehistory, that doesn't fit with what we know of the Marshall Islands' migration patterns. The standard timeline for the Polynesians arriving is around 50 AD, but even then, Bikini remained ignored. It was simply too remote, too far away to bother with. In fact, when the first Europeans sailed past the atoll in the 16th century, it seems likely that it was uninhabited. That all changed prior to 1824. We know this because 1824 was the year that Russian naval officer Otto von Kotzebue landed on Bikini and met its small group of natives. We should emphasize small here. The Bikini population was never much over 150, which meant an incredibly close-knit society. Aside from family ties, life on the atoll was based around little more than lagoon fishing, foraging for fruits and coconuts, and some very basic farming. While this was enough for the Bikini Islanders, it presented a very dim prospect for European colonists. Hence, Otto von Kotzebue basically getting off his ship, looking around, muttering the Russian equivalent of "to hell with this," and just sailing off again. The one thing von Kotzebue did gift the atoll was the name it was known by prior to World War II. He named it the Escholtz Islands. The rest of the 19th century passed with life on Bikini just carrying on as normal. It carried on as Portuguese missionaries arrived on the Marshall Islands, trailing Christianity in their wake. It carried on as the Germans annexed the islands in 1885, transforming them into engines for copra production. It only changed gear in 1908 when Christianity finally made it to the atoll. But while this was a relatively minor tweak, far bigger changes were just around the corner. In summer 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. By fall, Japan had joined the war on the side of the Allies. Its first act was to occupy the German-administered Marshall Islands. For Bikini Atoll, though, this was just another instance of, well, no real change then. Although Japan claimed the islands from 1914 onwards, Bikini was as remote as it ever had been, so Tokyo just ignored it. But while World War II may have mostly passed the atoll by, the same could not be said of the war's big-budget sequel. When World War II finally hit, it was going to sweep away everything the islanders held dear. For the best part of 30 years, the Japanese approach to the Marshall Islands was basically to say, just let them get on with it. But this benign attitude was never destined to last. As 1941 approached, it became clear that were the US to enter a war against Japan, Washington would use the Marshall Islands as a forward base in the Pacific. So the Japanese decided they'd just have to occupy the islands first. The 5 Japanese soldiers stationed on Bikini Atoll formed the islanders' first sustained contact with the outside world in history. But first doesn't necessarily mean most impressive. When US forces captured nearby Kwajalein Atoll in early 1944, the 5 Japanese soldiers committed suicide by unpinning a grenade in their foxhole. And, well, so much for Imperial Japan's presence on Bikini. Shortly after, the Americans took the atoll without firing a single bullet. But if the islanders initially welcomed the Americans as liberators, they were soon going to discover what liberty really meant. A year and a half after the Japanese lost the Marshall Islands on July 16, 1945, a flash of light in the New Mexico desert heralded the dawn of the atomic age. The Trinity Test was the world's first successful detonation of an atom bomb. Less than a month later, on August 6th, the plane passed over the Japanese city of Hiroshima and dropped a small device attached to a parachute. Below, thousands of people watched the bomb slowly fall with interest. When it exploded 580 meters above the ground, all of them had their retinas burned away by the flash. The bombing of Hiroshima killed 80,000 people in an instant and flattened the city. 3 days later, on August 9th, another bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, that one killing 40,000. From the ashes of those 120,000 lives, our nuclear world was born. Japan's surrender 6 days after Nagasaki is controversial today because it's not clear the twin nuclear attacks really were responsible. Some historians point to the Soviet Union's invasion of the Japanese Empire as the real culprit here. But there's no doubt that Washington, at least, thought their new superweapon was behind the surrender. That December, President Harry S. Truman instructed the Army and Navy to prepare a joint nuclear test. Although the rationale was to determine the effect of atomic bombs on American warships, the real reason was to remind the USSR of the power that was now at Washington's fingertips. The only problem was that Truman couldn't just drop a bomb off the coast of Hawaii and hope for the best. Oh no, a special place was needed, one suitably remote where the great powers wouldn't care what happens. You can almost imagine Truman picking up a globe and spinning it around, looking in earnest for somewhere far away, somewhere with a debt of gratitude to America. Almost imagine a sly smile crossing his lips as his finger plonks down on a remote island chain, looking for all the worlds like a giant's carelessly discarded necklace. In that moment, Bikini Atoll's fate was sealed. It would no longer be home to a small but vibrant culture. By the time America was done with it, it would barely be capable of supporting life at all. In February 1946, Commodore Ben H. Wyatt, the military governor of the Marshall Islands, landed on Bikini Atoll. It was a Sunday, and a church service was in full swing. Wyatt respectfully waited until it had finished, then asked all 167 Bikini Islanders to join him for a formal assembly. There, before the crowd, Wyatt laid out his stall. He wanted the Bikini Islanders to agree to leave their home on a temporary basis and relocate elsewhere. In return, this would allow America to conduct tests for, in his words, the good of mankind and to end all world wars. Wyatt patiently waited while the locals discussed his request. At long last, the island's leader clambered to his feet. "We will go, believing that everything is in the hands of God," he said. The very next month, Bikini Atoll was evacuated. All 167 islanders were loaded into a US Navy landing craft and sent 200 kilometers across the waters, eventually reaching Rongerik Atoll. A cluster of 17 small coral islands looping a vast lagoon, it was about as close to Bikini as the islanders could reasonably hope to get. Disembarking from their ship, they must have briefly felt like they'd found a new home. But note the operative word in that sentence: briefly. It soon became clear that Rongerik Atoll was less of a home and more of a death sentence. The fish in the lagoon were inedible, the ground was hostile to traditional crops, the coconuts the trees produced were far fewer than on Bikini. Within 2 months, the exiles were starving. They begged the US to let them return home. But by now, their home was being prepared for the greatest PR stunt in history. The logistics of the Operation Crossroads test almost defies comprehension. 242 ships, 156 aircraft, and 42,000 people all descended on tiny Bikini Atoll to witness the first nuclear detonation since World War II. There were soldiers, sailors, scientists, journalists, politicians, dignitaries. They were all invited to see this awesome display of American might. There were crates full of goats and pigs. 90 abandoned vessels left over from World War II were towed into the Bikini Lagoon. Come late June, Bikini Atoll was more alive than it had been in thousands of years of history. Ironically, all of this life had gathered only to witness the spectre of death. On July the 1st, the observers were taken out in Navy vessels until they were 18.5 kilometers from Bikini. Shortly after, a B-52 dropped its payload over the lagoon. This was a bomb named Gilda, decorated with a picture of Rita Hayworth. There was a blinding flash of light, a warm wind that whipped through the observer's hair, and then nothing but a mushroom cloud rising over the atoll. The Crossroads ABLE test sank 5 ships from the 90-odd scattered around the lagoon. Importantly, though, the radiation burst that accompanied it killed nearly all the livestock tied up in the abandoned ships. As a special bulletin enthusiastically reported, a large ship about a mile away from the explosion would escape sinking, but the crew would be killed by the deadly burst of radiations from the bomb, and only a ghost ship would remain floating unattended in the vast waters of the ocean. But even the ABLE test would have nothing on what came next. On July the 25th, the Crossroads BAKER test took place in the same lagoon. 30 meters underwater, the bomb, nicknamed Helen of Bikini, detonated at exactly 8:35 a.m. But while ABLE had produced a mushroom cloud and a brief flash of radiation, BAKER was destined to produce a catastrophe. But just before we get into that catastrophe, I do want to mention that I've got another channel called Business Blaze. It's a channel that's filled with facts and knowledge, but it's also a bit more of a laid-back format than this. It's all about business, but it's interesting. It looks at the most epic failures, things times went wrong, but also little-known successes.
Welcome to Business Blaze, channel ostensibly about business, which apparently no one watches. For the business content. And if you are watching for the business content, well, you're probably going to be a little bit disappointed.
Generally, it's just the weirdest stuff that I could find from the business world, like the biggest giveaway failures in business history, what went wrong with a fire festival, or just epic blazes where I'll knock out 30 wild business facts. But don't be put off if you're not into business stuff. Most people describe it as hardly being about business at all, and I'm not really sure if that's a selling point. But here we are.
Ba-da-bum-bum. I wasn't sure whether that was quite strong enough for a bit of bum-bum-ch, but we're getting towards, we're almost on the last page and we hadn't done it yet, so I know what you guys are like. You'll harangue me if we don't do this, so you're welcome.
Anyway, like I said, it's a bit more laid back than this channel. It throws a good amount of silliness and fun at you. Check it out through the link below, or just search Business Blaze, and let's get back to today's video. If you've seen images of Crossroads BAKER, you might recall a white dome rising out of the ocean, looking very unlike a mushroom cloud. That's because BAKER instantaneously turned millions of cubic tons of water into rapidly expanding steam, which in turn sent millions more tons of water shooting skywards. The result was a bubble of superheated spray nearly 2 kilometers tall and 600 meters wide, with walls almost 100 meters thick. It wasn't the only result, though. The force of the blast caused a 30-meter tsunami to sweep out in all directions, tossing smaller boats into the atoll's beaches. Underwater, a vast crater was gouged out of the seafloor. When all of those millions of tons of water fell back into the lagoon, they caused a surge over 270 meters high that swamped all the surviving ships, and 10 of them vanished beneath the waves. But the most dramatic sinking of all was probably the USS Arkansas. When the gigantic bubble of steam erupted out of the lagoon, the Arkansas was so close that it flipped up into the air onto its bow like a toy ship being tossed by a toddler. Despite weighing over 26,000 tons, the Arkansas stood upright for several seconds before toppling backwards into the lagoon. It's safe to say that this was a sight that none of the Navy men present had ever expected to see. The BAKER test so doused the ships in radiation that they couldn't be accessed for weeks. Those who did board them to check the damage were exposed to levels of radiation that badly impacted their health. It's thanks to this that Crossroads BAKER was later called the world's first nuclear disaster. Although another test, this one codenamed Charlie, had been planned, it was cancelled in the wake of BAKER. So destructive had Crossroads been that there wouldn't be another test on the atoll for almost 8 years. But by now, Bikini Atoll was already famous. That same summer, French fashion designer Louis Reard released a piece of swimwear so skimpy that the Vatican declared it sinful. To drum up even more controversy, Reard christened his invention the Bikini because, like the atom bomb, it was destined to make a bang. But what of the Bikini Islanders themselves? By March 1948, the food situation on Rongerik had got so dire that the US government again moved the exiles, this time to Kwajalein Atoll. Unfortunately, there was no room for them there, and the islanders had to live in tents beside a gigantic American airstrip. They were stuck there for 6 months before the US finally relocated them to Kili Island. Surrounded by rough seas, Kili had no lagoon, and it was terrible for growing crops. Again, edible fish were hard to catch, leaving the islanders reliant on American food aid. But this time, there would be no moving on. The exiles had finally reached their new home. This would be it now, for good. Despite telling the islanders their evacuation would only be temporary, the US had no intention of giving up their new proving grounds. No, they had other plans for Bikini, plans involving the biggest nuke in American history. The first hydrogen bomb was tested on November 1st, 1952, but while Ivy Mike did take place in the Marshall Islands, it didn't take place at Bikini. So, yes, you might be thinking the Bikini Atoll finally managed to catch a break. Really, though, it was more of a stay of execution. Although the US had mastered the hydrogen bomb, the government didn't want to just leave it at that. They wanted a hydrogen bomb so powerful it would make the world tremble. The bomb finally arrived in the form of Castle Bravo. Ironically, the most powerful bomb the US ever tested wasn't intended to be particularly special. Prior to the test, its yield was calculated at around 8 megatons, so it would have dwarfed the Baker test for sure, but it was on par with Ivy Mike. Instead, though, it wound up blowing at 15 megatons. If you're having trouble imagining 15 megatons, just first imagine those images of devastated Hiroshima. Now imagine a bomb 1,000 times bigger than the one that leveled the Japanese city. Well, that was Castle Bravo. The most powerful test in American history was conducted on March 1st, 1954, in the air above Bikini Atoll. At 6:45 a.m., a mushroom cloud 7 kilometers across appeared in a flash of red light that ignited the sky. The fireball shot 40 kilometers into the atmosphere. Below, in the Bikini Atoll lagoon, 3 islands were vaporized and a 2-kilometer-wide crater was blown into the seabed. The Atomic Heritage Foundation notes that sailors on ships nearly 50 kilometers away could see the shadow of their bones through their skin, that they could feel an intense heat over every inch of their faces, like from a blowtorch. One sailor present at Castle Bravo later reported, "We soon found ourselves under a large black and orange cloud that seemed to be dropping bright red balls of fire all over the ocean around us. I think many of us expected that we were witnessing the end of the world." The blast was so apocalyptic that it blew millions of tons of sand into the atmosphere. A few hours later, ash began to fall on Rongelap Atoll, 200 kilometers away. Not knowing what was happening, the children on the atoll played in the radioactive dust, licking it off their skin. That night, sickness swept the island. Children began vomiting, their hair falling out in chunks. And they weren't the only ones. The Japanese fishing vessel Fukuryu Maru had been on the very edges of the Bikini exclusion zone when Castle Bravo detonated. The light had been so bright, so red, that crew members thought the sun had somehow risen in the west. When the fallout landed on their ship, it left them all with nasty radiation burns that would shock the Japanese public. When news of Castle Bravo's unbelievable payload leaked, it caused outrage around the globe. The 1963 ban on atmospheric testing was in large part thanks to this one bomb detonated above Bikini. As a result, the last test ever carried out on the atoll took place on July 22nd, 1958. Just 4 years later, the era of American atmospheric nuclear tests was over. But while Bikini Atoll would never again be subjected to planet-sized explosions, its story still isn't done. There's still the fate of the Bikini Islanders that we need to deal with. Reading the story of the Bikini Island exiles today, it's tempting to think that someone in the State Department made dicking them over kind of their hobby. After the dumping of them on Kili Islands, the US government spent decades ignoring the Bikini Islanders' claims that they were starving, broke, and fed up with this cruddy island. Finally, in 1968, Lyndon B. Johnson roused himself long enough to declare that the islanders could finally return to their homeland. The Atomic Energy Commission even claimed of the much-nuked atoll, "There's virtually no radiation left, and we can find no discernible effect on either plant or animal life." But if the Bikini Islanders were expecting a happy ending, they were in for a nasty shock. The first 150 returned to Bikini in the early 1970s after spending a quarter of a century in the wilderness. By 1978, though, it had become apparent that Cesium-137 had gotten into the local food chain and that living on Bikini was almost akin to climbing into your microwave oven and setting it to slow cook. So that December, an American boat landed on the atoll and promptly re-evacuated all of the islanders. The really galling part for everyone must have been that Bikini Island was honestly safe. While Chernobyl still contains patches of land soaked in radioactivity, the ground in Bikini Atoll is safe to walk on, and you could live there year-round without suffering any ill effects. You could even survive by catching fish and never get sick. No, the problem is that the fruit and coconuts, staple parts of the Bikini diet, are now so dangerous that they practically glow. While the islanders would know better than to eat them, their children might not be so smart, and a bunch of leukemia-riddled kids is a risk the Bikini Islanders, nor Washington, is willing to take. Finally, 7 years after their second exile, the Bikini Islanders, stuck on Kili, sued the US government. The court case dragged on for years, which is kind of amazing when you remember that the US had literally exploded almost 24 nukes on the island and invited the entire world to witness. In 1991, America finally capitulated and promised to undertake a massive cleanup operation on Bikini Atoll. A trust fund was also set up for the Bikini Islanders and their descendants, and it was promised that any income from tourism that the atoll generated would go straight into that fund. But despite these warm words, one salient fact remains. The Bikini Islanders never made it back home. Today, Bikini Atoll is officially uninhabited, save for the boats of tourists that periodically wash up there, eager to see a part of atomic history. The sunken wreck of the USS Arkansas is now one of the world's most sought-after diving spots, and UNESCO has listed the atoll as a World Heritage Site. Yet the islanders, now numbering around 5,000, remain scattered and removed from their home. Recently, their new island of Kili also became threatened, this time by climate change. In response to a 2017 petition, the US released all $60 million held in the trust fund to the islanders, who have since used it to buy some backup island in Hawaii. Still, while the fate of the islanders may remain unsettled, there's no doubting the importance of their former home. It was here that Operation Crossroads marked one of the opening salvos in the Cold War, here that hydrogen weapons reached their terrifying full potential. It was also here that the core of the anti-nuclear movement was born, as the world witnessed the effects of Castle Bravo and decided no more. With above-ground nuclear testing now a thing of the past, it seems unlikely Bikini Atoll will ever again stand at the center of world events. But no one can deny that for a few decades in the mid-20th century, this tiny necklace of islands briefly became one of the most dangerous, most important places on the planet. Humans may have abandoned Bikini Atoll, but we'll certainly never forget it. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button and don't forget to subscribe. Also, why not go over and subscribe to another channel that I do called Business Blaze? I will link to that below. And thank you for watching.